Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, I shall be telling the story about how video games sometimes aren't very good at being video games, but they have competent enough writers to be able to tell a decent enough story, and I can understand that because, hey, I can't code video games, but I sure as hell can tell a good story. This is a French dictionary. We're all good at telling stories. You don't need a doctorate in English literature to be able to string sentences together within a setting while maintaining the right pace and implementing overarching themes because it honestly isn't that difficult. We spend our whole lives telling stories to anyone who'll listen, and you'd imagine that over time we get better at making it interesting to listen to. By contrast, making good video games is something that takes a bit more effort and research to understand, and certainly isn't as natural as telling a story. Video games are complicated, you know? And yet, the disconnect between normal gameplay and story can be kind of a good thing if the writers know what they're doing. Maybe it just goes to show that different skill sets are required to make a good game, and that a mediocre offering from one department doesn't necessarily equate to another department doing the same. I mean, thank God that two groups of people can work inside the same building and not suck the same amount of penis. It's like an oasis in the middle of a vast desert, and goddamn if I'm not gonna focus on it. Someone has to, right? There's every chance that I spend the duration of this video talking about how a game is terrible, but I want to clarify that whenever that happens, I'm strictly talking about gameplay stuff. I guess I could preface every negative comment with something that ensures that everyone watching knows exactly what I'm talking about, but all you need to know is that bad games can have good stories, and that arguably the most interesting side of that is the gameplay being kind of ropey or tedious or just kind of shitty. With that being said, Spec Ops The Line is a really boring video game. Like, really, genuinely, very boring. You know what I mean? But it really has to be for Spec Ops The Line to work as an interesting piece of media and not seem like another minuscule drop in the impossibly vast ocean of over-the-shoulder shooters. All of the trailers tried really hard to make Spec Ops seem like it wouldn't give you anything to be excited about, and honestly, you get an hour in, and apart from being able to manipulate sand in a kind of interesting way, it is every shooter you've played from the last decade and a little bit less. But this all makes for gradual realization that Spec Ops The Line isn't going for a feel-good, cathartic power fantasy all the more striking. No other game on this list is designed so that the gameplay is deliberately underwhelming, which makes me wonder if Spec Ops should be here in the first place, but it's an unpolished game at times. When you do have the rug pulled out from underneath you, the narrative fits perfectly with the average game you've played up until this point. You're shooting bad guys because you're trying so hard to lose yourself in all the heroism and bravado, but there isn't any. If the gameplay leading up to the transitional white phosphorus scene put a smile on your face and was inherently enjoyable as you pop off headshots left and right, the message would have been lost. You're trying so hard to find the fun, but maybe you shouldn't. Over time, I found that a good story usually gives a game enough charm so that you can look past some of the irregularities present in every other part of the game. I'm not sure it works so well the other way around, since you usually treat moments where the story becomes relevant either as interruptions or as a reward for battling through a disappointing video game. And if I'm really into a game for the game, I definitely don't want to be interrupted by some afterthought of a story. For a long time, I was put off the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series because every review I could find was giving these games 6 out of 10s or a 4.9? IGN, that's only a bit more than what you gave the new Bubsy game. I mean, I know you don't really like Pokemon, but it can't be that bad, surely. The Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series in general gets low review scores for falling apart at the game part of being a video game. And I can't say that I completely agree with the low scores, but I can see where they're coming from. In something like Explorers of Sky, the gameplay does get repetitive over time and might have benefited from being quicker and more strategic, and yes, this DS game does look an awful lot like a GBA game, but I can't say that I didn't have a lot of fun playing through it. Most importantly, given the nature of this video, the plot is phenomenal. Something that I love about this spin-off series is that they aren't afraid of telling complicated stories that far outmatch the game they're attached to. And Explorers of Sky spends dozens of hours telling you a deeply heartwarming and surprisingly mature mature tale that continues even after the credits have rolled. I kind of wish I played this game as a kid because I probably wouldn't mind the monotonous gameplay, and I'd have that kind of delayed appreciation for the plot that I have these days with oldish Zelda games. Nowadays, I'm just a cynical asshole about everything. I've heard arguments that older games, or really any game that doesn't look like a 3D cinematic marvel, will struggle to tell stories because of, I don't know, the graphics aren't very good or whatever, but they're not even remotely related. If Explorers of Sky can tell more convincing narrative than most AAA games on the market today, while still looking like a GBA game, what does that tell you about the focus of big budget games? You're right, it's loot boxes. Wait, that was last week, wasn't it? The hands of a developer are somewhat tied when remaking a game. By design, you can't just go around changing everything about it because the game you have at the end will bear no resemblance to the source material. And it's this kind of dilemma which comes up a lot when you're remaking bad games, but why would you be doing this in the first place? I don't want to be that guy who reminds everyone that Fire Emblem can only afford to take risks these days because the franchise has never been more popular, and without the influence of Awakening and Fates and all of those Smash Bros characters, we probably wouldn't have gotten 3 Fire Emblem games this year, but I'll do it anyway. And therein lies the inspiration behind Fire Emblem Echo Shadows of Valentia, a remake of Fire Emblem Gaiden from 1992, being done in a style not too dissimilar to Awakening and Fates. It's kind of a shame then that Gaiden isn't the best of games, so Echoes was always up against it here. The comparison I often see with Fire Emblem Gaiden is that of Zelda 2 and how it isn't a terrible game, just one that introduced a bunch of experimental features that weren't carried forward to the games that came after. Even though Echoes looks like a modern Fire Emblem game, it takes a lot of its features from Gaiden, including but not limited to a fatigue system that requires you to feed your characters in battle so they don't keel over, no rock paper scissors weapon triangle, frustrating map design, and a sharp difficulty curve at roughly the halfway mark. It all stacks up to make for an aggravating experience, but you keep going because Fire Emblem Echoes is the first Fire Emblem game to feature full voice acting. And alongside a genuinely interesting story where the two main characters are separated at the start but reunite years later with their own group of fighters with different ideologies, you persevere knowing that the story is fully capable of doing most of the heavy lifting. Improving the narrative is actually one of the most impressive things a remake can do, and all that was needed with Fire Emblem Echoes was some better characterization and the occasional cutscene to signify important events. It still feels awkward fighting without a weapon triangle though. Does paper beat rock? They're roughly the same actually. That's not confusing at all. Certain franchises put their focus on specific aspects of games, and you've got to play them with that in mind. So if you're playing a Mario game and you're looking for an intricate story full of misdirection and overarching themes, I don't want to say you're playing the game wrong, but you might be playing the game wrong. Metal Gear, or at least not the Phantom Pain or the twitching reanimated corpse of a Metal Gear game, tend to put the story on top and worry about the sneaky stealth gameplay a little later. I imagine that Kingdom Hearts was like this since the plot gets confusing very quickly, but the hack and slashing is easy to get to grips with and fairly refined. Though I guess it does depend which game you're playing at the time. I actually started with Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days because it was readily available to me, and I thought it would be interesting to see how a series like Kingdom Hearts would be able to squeeze itself onto a handheld. But then I told Josh Scorcher at the time, who knows an awful lot more about the series than I do, and he was scared for me, and probably should have seen the warning signs. The point being that you probably shouldn't play this game as an introduction to the ridiculous winding world of Kingdom Hearts because of how 358 over 2 days was heavily diluted so as to not upset the DS's hardware. The hacky slashy gameplay shows up from time to time, but it often feels like it's being suffocated by the large number of recon missions you do, where you wander around a familiar setting and look at some interesting crack in a wall or something. I don't know, it's a nice looking crack that reminds me of my resolve to keep playing this game. This in turn wreaks havoc on the pacing as 358 over 2 days struggles to build any momentum up between missions and turns the whole game into a war of attrition that you have to wade through in order to reach that juicy story. The problem I have with the typical Kingdom Hearts story is that while they might start out fairly basic, it doesn't take much for the flashbacks and the heavy jargon to take over and leave you feel like you're desperately trying to keep up with a complicated lecture. To its credit, 358 over 2 days is more of an isolated story this time around that doesn't rely so much on relating everything back to the wider universe, and instead gives the three main characters a lot of screen time and enough space to develop as personalities. Roxas, Axel and Shion spend so much time eating ice cream on top of the same clock tower that it gives the game some grounding in between missions, and I wish Kingdom Hearts did this more often. In fact, 358 over 2 days' story carries enough weight over the undeveloped gameplay that when Square Enix pulled together various Kingdom Hearts games for the 1.5 HD Remixed Remastered Collection thingy, they only included revamped cutscenes from 358 over 2 days and no gameplay of any sorts. It's probably for the best. Also, slightly unrelated, but if we as a species ever name a game something like 358 over 2 days ever again, I fucking quit! This franchise is confusing enough without fractions and decimals in the titles. If you want one franchise with consistently stupid plots that take themselves way too seriously, you really shouldn't look past Sonic the Hedgehog in all of his ironic glory. I'm not sure where this came from, but while Mario has kept things relatively simple over the years so that polished gameplay can take center stage, Sonic has been floundering from game to game, ensuring that it's leaving behind a melodramatic story that fluctuates from stupid to shallow to way too complicated, and my personal favorites, oddly and hilariously serious. Sometimes I feel like someone needs to remind Sega and Sonic Team that people probably don't play Sonic games for the elaborate narrative. Or at least they shouldn't, he's a fucking hedgehog! But alas, there's such a thing as the Sonic Storybook series, a collection of 2 games where the blue guy travels into the world of storybooks to defeat evil or something, I don't fucking care. It doesn't matter because those games are Sonic and the Secret Rings, and Sonic and the Black Knight, so, you know, it doesn't really, no one cares. But one of these games has a really good story in there. It isn't this one. I should mention that Sonic and the Black Knight was released at a point before the franchise had regrouped after Sonic 06 and was still trying to find itself. And by find itself, I mean try pointless gimmick after pointless gimmick rather than do the sensible thing and really refine traditional Sonic gameplay. This is why Sonic and the Black Knight is an agonizing game to sit down and play, because they give Sonic a sword, because that's fun I guess, and you waggle it with a Wiimote like a lunatic, but you're stuck on a linear path, so it plays like an on-rail shooter but with clunky controls and no sense of speed that Sonic is famous for, and you're sent to do these pointless missions that don't feel connected in any way. And how far away is Sonic Colors? A year? Oh, fuck me sideways. But if you can ignore all of that, I know it's kinda hard, but just see what you can do. There is a plot going on, and it's genuinely pretty decent. The dialogue can be pretty cheesy, especially since most of it comes out of Sonic's mouth, and you've got Sonic characters in suits of armor, which is kinda stupid. But behind all of this is a well-presented story with great presentation and some really stylish cutscenes. It's even got a few surprising plot twists thrown in there for good measure that don't come off as contrived, which is frankly a miracle all things considered. You can tell at multiple stages that some thought was put into the narrative so that characters have well-defined motives, and Sonic grows over the course of the game because he doesn't know how to use a fucking sword. That shit's gonna take time! Maybe if the rest of the game wasn't made by drooling idiots, we might have been in business. This is RabbidLuigi, and the single most frustrating aspect of the not very good 3D Sonic games is that they often do one thing really, really well. So there's amazing music in Sonic 06, Sonic Forces has that endless amount of character customization, and there's a really competent story in Sonic and the Black Knight, which only serves to make everything else really disappointing when you see that they can do something right in that very same game. What I think they should do is take each individual component, compile it into one super amazing Sonic game, we'll put him back on top, and the world may collapse in on itself. Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn into a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.